Welcome back to this reading corner. We're reading Pride and Prejudice. Boo, 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 boo. Chapter 9. I get worried getting into the higher levels of chapters that we are in Roman numeral territory. So there's going to be some math happening with these chapter numbers. 10 minus 1 is 9. Okay, chapter 9. Jane Bennet is still sick. Jane Bennet is still sick. I did see on here, what did they do to manage, how did people survive UTIs back in the day? Listen to this. Management included hospitalization, bed rest, attention to diet, plasters, don't know what that is, narcotics, herbal enemas and douches, judicious bleeding, direct bleeding, cupping, and leeches, and surgery for stones and abscesses and retention. Wow. Treatment for gonorrhea was largely symptomatic, and for syphilis was use of toxic metals such as arsenic. Back in the day was crazy, but they didn't think it was crazy. It was just normal. Okay, sorry. I just saw that from last time. How people did stuff back in the day. It's amazing that we're all even still here. Especially with like dentistry. Like the mouth is such a dirty place, and now we have all this dentistry, but how did we all survive like the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution? Okay, let's get back into this world. Pride and Prejudice. Beautiful. Elizabeth passed the chief of the night in his sister's room, and in the morning had the pleasure of being able to send a tolerable answer to the inquiries which she very early received from Mr. Bingley by a housemaid, and some time afterwards from the two elegant ladies who waited on her sister. In spite of this amendment, however, she requested to have a note sent to Longbourn, desiring her mother to visit Jane and form her own judgment of the situation. The note was immediately dispatched, and its contents as quickly complied with. Mrs. Bennet, accompanied by her two younger sisters, reached Netherfield soon after the family breakfast. Good heavens, are we to receive all the Bennets in the country? She had found Jane in any apparent danger, Mrs. Bennet would have been very miserable, but being satisfied on seeing her that her illness was not alarming, she had no wish of her recovering immediately, as her restoration to health would probably remove her from Netherfield. This mom, good for her. Wow. She said, no, this is perfect. Everything's happening perfectly. Don't come home. She would not listen, therefore, to her daughter's proposal of being carried home. Neither did the apothecary, who arrived about the same time, think it all advisable. After sitting a little while with Jane on Miss Bingley's appearance and invitation, the mother and three daughters all tended her into the breakfast parlour. Bingley met them with hopes that Mrs. Bennet had not found Miss Bennet worse than she expected. Indeed I have, sir, was her answer. She is a great deal too ill to be moved. Mr. Jones says we must not think of moving her. We must trespass a little longer in your kindness. Removed, cried Bingley. It must not be thought of. My sister, I am sure, will not hear of her removal. You may depend on it, madam, said Miss Bingley with cold civility, that Miss Bennet will receive every possible attention while she remains with us. Mrs. Bennet was profuse in her acknowledgments. I am sure, she added, if it was not for such good friends, I do not know what would become of her, for she is very ill indeed, and suffers a vast deal, though with the greatest patience in the world, which is always the way with her, for she has, without exception, the sweetest temper I've ever met with. I often tell my other girls they are nothing to her. You have a sweet room here, Mr. Bingley, and a charming prospect over the gravel wall. I do not know a place in the country with that is equal to Netherfield. You will not think of quitting it in a hurry, I hope, though you have but a short lease. Whatever I do is done in a hurry, replied he, and therefore if I should resolve to quit Netherfield, I should probably be off in 5 minutes. At present, however, I consider myself as quite fixed here. That is exactly what I should have supposed of you, said Elizabeth. You begin to comprehend me, do you? He cried, turning towards her. Oh, yes, I understand you perfectly. I wish I might take this for a compliment, but to be so easily seen through, I'm afraid, is pitiful. That is as it happens. It does not follow that a deep, intricate character is more or less estimable than such a one as yours. Lizzie, cried her mother, remember where you are, and do not run on in the wild manner that you are suffered to do at home. I did not know before, continued Bingley immediately, that you were a studier of character. It must be an amusing study. Yes, but intricate characters are the most amusing. They have at least that advantage. On the contrary, said Darcy, can in general supply but a few subjects for such a study. The contrary can in general supply but a few subjects for such a study. In a country neighborhood, you move in a very confined and unvarying society. You don't have a lot of test subjects. But these people themselves alter so much that there is something new to be observed in them forever. Yes, indeed, cried Mrs. Bennet. Yes, indeed, cried Mrs. Bennet, offended by his manner of mentioning a country neighborhood. I assure you there is quite as much of that going on in the country as in town. Everybody was surprised, and Darcy, after looking at her for a moment, turned silently away. Mrs. Bennet, who fancied that she gained a compliment victory over him, continued her triumph. Ugh. I cannot see that London has any great advantage over the country for my part, except the shops and public places. The country is a vast deal pleasanter, is it not, Mr. Bingley? When I am in the country, he replied, I never wish to leave it, and when I am in town it is pretty much the same. They have each their advantages, and I can't be equally happier in either. Anywhere you go, there you are. And Mr. Bingley is just happy as a clam everywhere he is. So, aye, that is because you have the right disposition. But that gentleman, looking at Darcy, seemed to think the country was nothing at all. Oh, she said this. Aye, that is because you have the right disposition. But that gentleman, looking at Darcy, seemed to think the country was nothing at all. Indeed, mamma, you are mistaken, said Elizabeth, blushing for her mother. You quite mistook Mr. Darcy. He only meant that there was not such a variety of people to be met in the country as in town, which you must acknowledge to be true. Certainly, my dear, nobody said there were, but as to not meeting with many people in this neighbourhood, I believe there are a few neighbourhoods larger. I know we dine with 24 families. That means 24, I'm pretty sure. Nothing but concern for Elizabeth could enable Bingley to keep his countenance. His sister was less delicate, and directed her eyes toward Mr. Darcy with a very expressive smile. Elizabeth, for the sake of saying something that might turn her mother's thoughts, now asked if Charlotte Lucas had been at Longbourn since her coming away. Yes, she called yesterday with her father. What an agreeable man Sir William is. Mr. Bingley, is he not? So much the man of fashion, so genteel and easy. He had always something to say to everybody. That is my idea of good breeding. And those persons who fancy themselves very important and never open their mouths quite mistake the matter. Did Charlotte dine with you? No, she would go home. I fancy she was wanted about the mince pies. For my part, Mr. Bingley, I always keep servants that do their own work. My daughters are brought up very differently, but everybody is to judge for themselves, and the Lucases are very good sort of girls, I assure you. It is a pity they are not handsome. Not that I think Charlotte is so very plain, but then she is our particular friend. She seems a very pleasant woman. Oh, dear, yes, but you must own she is very plain. Lady Lucas herself has often said so, and envied me Jane's beauty. I do not like to boast of my own child, but to be sure, Jane, one does not often see anybody better looking than her. It is what everybody says. I do not trust my own partiality. When she was only 15, there was a man at my brother Gardner's in town, so much in love with her that my sister-in-law was sure he would make her an offer before we came away, but however he did not. Perhaps he thought her too young. However, he wrote some verses on her, and very pretty they were. And so ended his affection, said Elizabeth impatiently. There has been many a one, I fancy, overcome in the same way. I wonder who first discovered the efficacy of poetry in driving away love. I have been used to consider poetry as the food of love, said Darcy. Oh, a fine, stout, healthy love it may. Everything nourishes what is strong already. But if it only be a slight, thin sort of inclination, I am convinced that one good sonnet would starve it entirely away. Darcy only smiled, and the general pause which ensued made Elizabeth tremble lest her mother should be exposing herself again. She longed to speak, but could think of nothing to say, and after a short silence Mrs. Bennet began repeating her thanks to Mr. Bingley for his kindness to Jane, with an apology for troubling him also with Lizzie. Mr. Bingley was unaffectedly civil in his answer, and forced his younger sister to be civil also and say what the occasion required. She performed her part indeed without much graciousness, but Mrs. Bennet was satisfied, and soon afterwards ordered her carriage. Upon the signal, the youngest of her daughters put herself forward. The two girls had been whispering to each other during the whole visit, and the result of it was that the youngest should tax Mr. Bingley with having promised on his first coming into the country to give a ball at Netherfield. Lydia was stout, well-grown girl of 15, with a fine complexion and good-humoured countenance, a favourite with her mother, whose affection had brought her into public at an early age. She had high animal spirits and sort of natural self-consequence, which the attention of the officers, to whom her uncle's good dinners and her own easy manners recommended her, had increased into assurance. She was very equal, therefore, to address Mr. Bingley on the subject of the ball, and abruptly reminded him of his promise, adding that it would be the most shameful thing in the world if he did not keep it. Everything is so. This is the most shameful thing in the whole world. Wow. His answer to this sudden attack was delightful to their mother's ear. I am perfectly ready, I assure you, to keep my engagement, and when your sister's recovered, you shall, if you please, name the very day of the ball. But you would not wish to be dancing when she is ill. Let your daughter get better. Lydia declared herself satisfied. Oh, yes, it would be much better to wait till Jane was well, and by that time most likely Captain Carter would be at Meryton again. And when you have given your ball, she added, I shall insist on their giving one also. I shall tell Colonel Forster it would be quite a shame if he does not. The shame of the whole world. Mrs. Bennet and her daughters then departed, and Elizabeth returned instantly to Jane, leaving her own and her relations' behaviour to the remarks of the two ladies and Mr. Darcy, the latter of whom, however, could not be prevailed on to join in their censure of her, in spite of all Miss Bingley's witticisms on fine eyes. They were at it again. Oh, man. Mrs. Bennet's just trying to hype up her kids, you know? She's like the best hype woman for these kids. Chapter 10. Chapter 10, Pride and Prejudice. The day passed much as the day before had done. Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley had spent some hours in the morning with the invalid, who continued, though slowly, to mend, and in the evening Elizabeth joined their party in the drawing-room. The loo table, however, did not appear. Mr. Darcy was writing, and Miss Bingley, seated near him, was watching the progress of his letter and repeatedly calling off his attention by messages to his sister. Mr. Hurst and Mr. Bingley were at the piquet, and Mrs. Hurst was observing their game. Elizabeth took up some needlework, and was sufficiently amused in attending to what passed between Darcy and his companions. The perpetual commendations of the lady, either on his handwriting, or the evenness of his lines, or the length of his letter, or with the perfect unconcern with which her praises were received, formed a curious dialogue, and was exactly in union with her opinion of each. How delighted Miss Darcy will be to receive such a letter! He made no answer. You write uncommonly fast. You are mistaken, I write rather slowly. How many letters you must have occasion to write in the course of a year. Letters of business, too. How odious I should think them. It is fortunate, then, that they fall to my lot instead of yours. Pray tell your sister that I long to see her. I have already told her so once by your desire. I am afraid you do not like your pen. Let me mend it for you. I mend pens remarkably well. Thank you, but I always mend my own. How can you contrive to write so even? He was silent. Tell your sister I am delighted to hear of her improvement on the harp, and pray let her know that I am quite in raptures with her beautiful design for her table, and I think it infinitely superior to Miss Grantley's. Will you give me leave to defer your raptures till I write again? At the present I have not room to do them justice. Oh, it is of no consequence. I shall see her in January. But you do always write such charming long letters to her, Mr. Darcy. They are generally long, but whether always charming it is not for me to determine. It is a rule with me that a person who can write a long letter with ease cannot write ill. That will not do for a compliment. To Darcy, Caroline, cried her brother, because he does not write with ease. He studies too much for words of 4 syllables. Do you not, Darcy? He studies too much for words of 4 syllables. My style of writing is very different from yours. Oh, cried Miss Bingley, Charles writes in the most careless way imaginable. He leaves out half his words and blots the rest. My ideas flow so rapidly that I have not time to express them, by which means my letters sometimes convey no ideas at all to my correspondents. Your humility, Mr. Bingley, said Elizabeth, must disarm reproof. Nothing is more deceitful, said Mr. Darcy, than the appearance of humility. It is often only carelessness of opinion, and sometimes an indirect boast. And which of the two do you call my little recent piece of modesty? The indirect boast, for you are really proud of your defects in writing, because you consider them as proceeding from a rapidity of thought and careless of execution, which, if not estimable, you think at least highly interesting. The power of doing anything with quickness is always prized much by the professor, and often without any attention to the imperfection of the performance. When you told Mrs. Bennet this morning that if you ever resolved upon quitting Netherfield, you should be gone in 5 minutes, you meant it to be a sort of pan. I don't even know how to say this word. Okay, push pause on the audio for a second if you already know what this word means. Panegyric. You guys, sorry. I'm going to learn how to say it, and I'm going to learn what it is right now. Thank you, Google. Thank you, Google. Panegyric. Let's learn how to say it. Panegyric. A public speech or published text in praise of someone or something. Vera's panegyric on friendship. What's a synonym for panegyric? Eulogy, a tribute. Okay. Panegyric. So this morning, you resolved upon quitting Netherfield, you should be gone in 5 minutes. You meant it to be sort of a panegyric of compliment to yourself. And yet, what is there to be so very laudable in a precipitance which must leave very necessary business undone, and can be of no real advantage to yourself or anyone else? Nay, cried Bingley, this is too much to remember at all night Nay, cried Bingley, this is too much to remember at night all the foolish things that were said in the morning, and yet upon my honour I believe what I said of myself to be true, and I believe it at this moment. At least, therefore, I did not assume the character of needless precipitance, merely to show off before the ladies. I dare say you believed it, but I am by no means convinced that you would be gone with such celerity. That's something to do with celery. Hold on, just let me look up celerity. Celerity, maybe it means like quickness? Clarity? Celerity. Celerity, you would not be gone with celerity. Swiftness. Great. Celerity. The woman doing, why does she sound celerity? would be gone with such celerity. Your conduct would be quite as dependent on chance as that of any man I know. And if, as you were mounting your horse, a friend would say, Bingley, you had better stay till the next week, you would probably do it. You would probably not go, and at another word, might stay a month. You've only proved by this, cried Elizabeth, that Mr. Bingley did not do justice his own disposition. You've shown him off now much more than he did himself. I am exceedingly gratified, said Bingley, by your converting what my friend says into a compliment on the sweetness of my temper, but I am afraid you are giving it a turn which that gentleman did by no means intend, for he would certainly think better of me, if under such a circumstance I were to give a flat denial and ride off as fast as I could. Would Mr. Darcy then consider the rashness of your original intentions as atoned for by your obstinacy in adhering to it? Upon my word, I cannot exactly explain the matter. Darcy must speak for himself. Even just that sentence, would Mr. Darcy then consider the rashness of your original intentions as atoned for by your obstinacy in adhering to it? It doesn't feel like English. It just feels like it's falling out of my mouth, and my brain is like, these words are too big. Public school. You expect me to account for opinions which you choose to call mine, but which I have never acknowledged. Allowing the case, however, to stand according to your representations, you must remember, Miss Bennet, that the friend who is supposed to desire his return to the house and the delay of his plan has merely desired it, asked it without offering one argument in favor of his propriety. To yield readily, easily, to the persuasion of a friend is no merit with you. To yield without conviction is no compliment to the understanding of either. You appear to me, Mr. Darcy, to allow nothing for the influence of friendship and affection. A regard for the requester would often make one readily yield to a request, without waiting for arguments to reason one into it. I am not particularly speaking of such a case as you have supposed about Mr. Bingley. We may as well wait, perhaps, till the circumstance occurs, before we discuss the discretion of his behaviour thereupon. But in general and ordinary cases, between friend and friend, where one of them is desired by the other to change a resolution of no very great moment, should you think ill of that person for complying with the desire without waiting to be argued with? Will it not be advised, before we proceed on this subject, to arrange with rather more precision the degree of importance which is to appertain to this request, as well as the degree of intimacy subsisting between the parties? By all means, cried Miss Bingley, let us hear all the particulars, not forgetting their comparative height and size, for that will have more weight in the argument, Miss Bennet, than you may be aware of. I assure you that if Darcy were not such a great tall fellow, in comparison with myself, I should not pay him half so much difference. I declare I do not know a more awful object than Darcy on particular occasions and in particular places, at his own house especially, and of a Sunday evening, when he has nothing to do. Mr. Darcy smiled, but Elizabeth thought she could perceive that he was rather offended, and therefore checked her laugh. Miss Bingley warmly resented the indignity he had received, and an expostulation with her brother for talking such nonsense. I see your design, Bingley, said his friend. You dislike an argument and want to silence this. Perhaps I do. Arguments are too much like disputes. If you and Miss Bennet will defer to yours till I am out of the room, I shall be very thankful, and then you may say whatever you like of me. What you ask, said Elizabeth, is no sacrifice on my side, and Mr. Darcy had much better finish his letter. Mr. Darcy took her advice and did finish his letter. So what were they just talking about? They were just talking about Mr. Bingley said that he would be off fast, but then it was like, well, what if somebody told you to stay and then you would stay for a month? And what is that? Is that like you're just at the whims of all of your friends? This whole conversation I'm confused about. It's just like too many big words, and they're having a tete-a-tete, and I'm confused about it. So now Mr. Darcy's just back to finishing his letter. Sorry, I just don't even know what that was all about. Just friends being friends. Friends talking to friends and new friends trying to get to know old friends, and old friends' old friends are in the... Okay. When that business was over, he applied to Miss Bingley and Elizabeth for an indulgence of some music. Miss Bingley moved with some alacrity to the pianoforte. Alacrity. Alacrity. I feel brisk and cheerful readiness. That's what I would have read it as. Alacrity. Great. She accepted the invitation with alacrity. That's exactly what happened. Absolutely, I'll go play something on the pianoforte. Polite request, alacrity, pianoforte. And after a polite request that Elizabeth would lead the way, which the other as politely and more earnestly negated, she seated herself. Negatived. Mrs. Hurst sang with her sister, and while they were thus employed, Elizabeth could not help observing, as she turned over some music books that lay on the instrument, how frequently Mr. Darcy's eyes were fixed on her. Ooh. She hardly knew how to suppose that she could be an object of admiration to so great a man, and yet that he should look at her because he disliked her was still more strange. She could only imagine, however, at last that she drew his notice because there was something more wrong and reprehensible, according to his idea of right, than in any other person present. Their supposition did not pain her. She liked him too little to care for his approbation. Yeah, but you kind of do, though, because you think this man is so great and so hard. Approbation, approval, or praise. I'm not getting any approbation making these videos, I'll tell you that. Just kidding. Approbation. You just like, I know that I do not fit in this whole entire house, and I'm just here for my sister, and I know I'm not getting along with anyone. After playing some Italian songs, Miss Bingley varied the charm by a lively Scotch air, and soon afterwards Mr. Darcy, drawing near Elizabeth, said to her, "Whoa!" He drew near to Elizabeth and said this, "Woo! Do not you feel a great inclination, Miss Bennet, to see such an opportunity of dancing a reel?" She smiled but made no answer. He repeated the question with some surprise at her silence. "Oh," she said, "I heard you before, but I could not immediately determine what to say in reply. You wanted me, I know, to say yes, that you might have the pleasure of despising my taste. But I always delight in overthrowing those kinds of schemes and cheating a person of their premeditated contempt. I have therefore made up my mind to tell you that I do not want to dance at a reel at all, and now despise me if you dare." Indeed I do not dare." Elizabeth, having rather expected to affront him, was amazed at his gallantry, but there was a mixture of sweetness and archness in her manner which made it difficult for her to affront anybody, and Darcy had never been so bewitched by any woman as he was by her. He really believed that there was not for the inferiority of connections he should be in some danger. Whoa. And like she is taking on these new people really well, and like talking to them and like challenging them, and he at the first ball was like, "I don't like talking to people that are outside of my intimate circle," and so he's observing her like, wow, she's doing really well. But to ask somebody that to dance a reel, like, whoa, dance a reel, I just want to know what that means and what that looks like. A reel is a folk dance type, as well as becoming a dance tune type of Scottish origin. Okay, dance a reel. It's, is it like Michael Flatley? What was that called? Do you guys remember Michael Flatley? I'm just probably offending everybody. Michael Flatley, Lord of the Dance. Lord of the Dance. Was this a reel? I'm certain it wasn't. Was this a reel? Oh, what has Michael Flatley been diagnosed with? Riverdance. Wow. Michael Flatley's on Instagram. That's incredible. Why doesn't Michael Flatley dance anymore? Wow. Nothing's opening up and it's pissing me off. I can't open anything. Google's broken. I've asked too many questions. I'd love for it to one day just be like, show up on a video, like if I've been streaming to, if I've been like doom scrolling, if they were like, you're all caught up, like they do on Instagram, you're all caught up on the whole internet. We've actually seen every video on the internet. That'd be so funny. This Bingley saw or suspected enough to be jealous, and her great anxiety for the recovery of her dear friend Jane received some assistance from her desire of getting rid of Elizabeth. She often tried to provoke Darcy into disliking her guest by talking of the supposed marriage and planning his happiness in such an alliance. I hope, she said, as they were talking together in the shrubbery the next day, you will give your mother-in-law a few hints when this desirable event takes place as to the advantage of holding her tongue. And if you can compass it, do cure the younger girls of running after officers, and if I may mention so delicate a subject, endeavour to check that little something bordering on conceit and impertinence which your lady possesses. Have you anything else to propose for my domestic felicity? Oh, yes. Do let the portraits of your uncle and Aunt Phillips be placed at the gallery at Pemberley. Put them next to your great-uncle the judge. They are all in the same profession, you know, only different lines. As for your Elizabeth's picture, you must not have it taken, for what painter could do justice to those beautiful eyes? This woman is a witch. It would not be easy indeed to catch their expressions, but their colour and shape and the eyelashes, so remarkably fine, might be copied. At that moment they were met from the other walk, and from another walk by Mrs. Hudson and Elizabeth herself. I did not know that you intended to walk, said Miss Bingley, in some confusion, lest they had been overheard. You used us abominably ill, answered Mrs. Hurst, running away without telling us you were coming out. Then, taking the disengaged arm of Mr. Darcy, she left Elizabeth to walk by herself. The path just admitted 3. Mr. Darcy felt their rudeness and immediately said, This walk is not wide enough for our party. We had better go into the avenue. That's so nice. Wow, Darcy just shines through sometimes. It's like almost choking me up, where he's like, you're being a bitch. That's really sweet. This walk is not wide enough for our party. But Elizabeth, who had not the least inclination to remain with him, laughingly answered, No, stay where you are. You are charmingly grouped, and appear to uncommon advantage. The picturesque would be spoilt by admitting a 4th. Goodbye. Good for her. She then ran gaily off. This doesn't normally happen. I think it's this type of writing. Or I am dyslexic when I read out loud, and I don't know if I'm like offending dyslexic people by saying that, but something is amiss. She then ran gaily off, rejoicing as she rambled about. I'm just going to go ramble about. I'm going to say that next time I go for a walk. In the hope of being at home again in a day or 2, Jane was already so much recovered as to intend leaving her room for a couple hours that evening. End of chapter 10. It does feel like a weird place to end a chapter, and I almost feel like I just want to keep going, but you know, I do want to keep these videos short so people can take rest breaks when they need to. And I just, 30 to 40 minutes is a perfect time for people to stay engaged, me personally. Happy reading, everyone. I hope everyone's enjoying this, and can't wait to see us all tomorrow back together again for Reading Corner, Chapter 11, Pride and Prejudice.